Welcome back. A phone is the African continent's status symbol of choice, but a new survey across 5 African nations has thrown up some surprising results. Nokia remains the single biggest phone brand in Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Uganda and South Africa. And reports of the death of Blackberry have been vastly exaggerated because, in fact, the survey shows that Blackberry phones are gaining in popularity. The Mobile Africa 2015 study was conducted by GeoPoll and World Wide Worx. It was based on a survey of 3,500 mobile phone users. To discuss, we're joined by Arthur Goldstuck, the head of World Wide Worx. Great to have you with us.
Good evening,
Arthur.
Francis.
So, Nokia is in the lead, but you're noticing that people are replacing their Nokia phones with others. So I would think the race is between Samsung and Apple. Are they next in line? And I see Blackberry, surprisingly, still in that race, in fact.
Well, Samsung is definitely the winner in terms of what people are planning to use next. So what we're seeing at the moment is one of the most dramatic swings in phone brand preference that we've ever seen on this continent. Right now, for example, Nokia is being used by 34% of respondents across these 5 countries. And the Samsung devices are at about half that level, 17%. But when we ask people what they intend to use next, not necessarily what they'll buy, but based on what they'll be getting next, buying or getting hand-me-downs, Samsung suddenly leaps up to 26% and Nokia falls below 20%. So we're seeing, in effect, the almost disappearance of Nokia as a leading brand across Africa.
And where does Apple fit into that? Because these projections kind of look at the global race as well, because Africa will become more and more important, I presume, in that.
Where people get it wrong with Apple is they assume because it's so big in the United States, it will be big in Africa. The problem is that Apple phones are top-end phones. In other words, they're the most expensive phones on the market, along with the flagship phones from the likes of Samsung. But the difference is that Samsung has phones across every price bracket, whereas iPhone or Apple only has iPhones at the very top of the range. So the result is that currently around 2% of respondents in this survey are using Apple. And that tallies with our previous research in South Africa as well, that has about 2% of the overall market. But when we ask people what they hope to use next, it suddenly leaps up to about 11%. So there's a big aspirational value to Apple. But ironically, the biggest aspiration is for Blackberries. And that's going to shock a lot of people who think Blackberry is yesterday's news.
Yeah.
But there's a fascinating phenomenon at work here, and that is that the feature phone market, you could say the bottom end of the market, is looking to getting their first smartphones during this period. And for them, the smartphone brand that really has captured Africa's imagination over the last few years has been Blackberry. And what's happening is that the Blackberries are being handed down now as people upgrade to Samsungs in particular, or brands like Sony, LG and Huawei. And those Blackberries are being handed down to people who previously only had feature phones. So suddenly you're seeing a resurgence, not because their sales are so strong, but because the continued usage and the pass-on effect is so powerful.
So this is all about economics. It doesn't say much about the sophistication of the market because economics plays such an important role. I mean, people were lambasting Blackberry. They came out with a smartphone that was just so late with nothing unique to it. But that's a very top end. So we're talking about economics being the main factor.
Precisely. It's economics on the one hand, but it's aspiration on the other hand. Having that Blackberry, particularly in a country like Nigeria, where in fact there was a series of movies on what they called Blackberry Babes. It was a phenomenon in Nigeria. There you're seeing that aspirational value still holding firm within the lower end of the market, even as the upper end of the market moves on to Samsung and Apple devices. And as I said, Sony, LG also making a strong appearance. And then brands like Alcatel, even ZTE also coming up strong.
All right, so Blackberry Babes in Nigeria. How does South Africa, do we look different to these other nations surveyed?
South Africa is different in that Blackberry was very dominant at one point, second only to Nokia in terms of overall market share, and leading Samsung, but only slightly, and then falling back strongly. But now also in South Africa, you're seeing that hand-me-down effect happening at the lower end of the market. What's happening in South Africa is the biggest shift ever from feature phones to smartphones. And people want that smartphone, I won't say at all costs, they want it at no cost really, or at very low cost.
Yeah.
So you're seeing smartphones costing between 550 Rand and 1,000 Rand suddenly selling in massive numbers.
Is that Huawei coming in there?
Huawei is big in that segment. Alcatel is very big in that segment. Just this week they launched phones using the Firefox operating system. And those are quality phones at a low cost, very appealing looking devices. And that's also going to make an impact. And then Samsung also has phones in that bracket. Phones like the Samsung Ace and the Star are very popular at the entry level. And then you have the hand-me-down phones, in particular the Blackberries, which have had such a dramatic impact on the slightly higher level from there. So phones costing between 1,000 and 3,000 Rand, Blackberry dominated there. And those are the phones in particular that are being passed on.
Okay, you've also looked at how people use their phones, and there were these reports, like you say, about Nigerians, Kenyans getting online. Where was South Africa in this? Surprisingly, you say we're not that bad, we're not looking that bad when it comes to internet connectivity still. Just explain.
Well,
that
this was another fascinating finding. If we ask people if they use the internet on their phones, then we find that Nigeria was well ahead of South Africa in terms of the proportion of the population using the internet on their phones. But when we looked at the intensity of use and the extent to which people downloaded apps and that kind of thing, in other words, data-intensive use of their phones, we found South Africa was well ahead of Nigeria. And that tells us that connectivity, in fact, is better in South Africa.
So that's linked to infrastructure and speeds and things like this.
Exactly.
Were you surprised? Because you've complained about the delay in 4G, about slowing speeds in South Africa. You've looked at government's role in that. So were you surprised, or is this just a case of us being relatively better,
Yes.
but the standard is low in Africa?
Now, I wasn't surprised at all, because we've been arguing for a long time that the high numbers that we're seeing from Nigeria are about people not having any other form of access to the internet. Whereas in South Africa, it started off with fairly strong access via ADSL and other forms of computer-based access. And now the smartphone explosion is resulting in a rapid growth of that kind of access, but on fairly good infrastructure. And when I say good infrastructure, it's not ideal. We're being held back by government's inability to push for the licensing of 4G technology, for example. Now, in Nigeria, they're still a long way from even having that aspiration. Yes, 4G will be licensed there, but the infrastructure to support it is still a long way off. So massive uptake of internet, but very poor internet quality.
Final question. So we still want faster speeds. We still have to move forward at a much quicker pace. What about costs? And just quickly, your reaction to Vodacom's recent increase in their contract fees and their arguments around that.
There's two sides to that story. The one is that the networks are under pressure, high costs of infrastructure rollout, and decreasing margins, rapidly decreasing margins. But at the same time, the other side of the story is that they have to prepare consumers for those kind of increases, and they can't just do it mid-contract. And that's the real negative fallout from that move for Vodacom. But they probably do need to increase prices at some point.
All right, thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you.
As always, the head of World Wide Worx, Arthur Goldstuck.